Hello and welcome to EGX Digital. This is Catherine from Rock Paper Shotgun, and for the next sort of 45 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about the next game from the creators of the smash hit 80 Days and the critically acclaimed Heaven's Vault. The game is called Pendragon. It's a narrative strategy game set in the broken land of Camelot. King Arthur's famous round table is no more, and it's up to you to rally Arthur's knights and supporters to help him win a decisive battle against the evil Sir Mordred. With its turn-based tactical combat, Pendragon's quite the departure for Inkle Studios. So here to chat with me about it is their narrative director, Jon Ingold. So, Jon, sort of before we get started, perhaps you could give the people watching a brief kind of overview of what Pendragon is and how it works.
So we've been talking about Pendragon as a narrative strategy game, which is one of those terms that we made up to try and explain what it was that we were doing, because there aren't really any terms to describe what we're doing, because there never really are good terms for the games that we make, because we always tend to mash things together a bit. But what we mean is it's a board-based tactics game, roughly speaking, perhaps a bit like the Banner Saga. Perhaps it's a little bit easier and kind of more elegant than that. We try to streamline the gameplay down to its essentials, but it's basically a board-based tactics game. But it's also a narrative game in that the story is always happening, and everything you do in the game causes the story to happen, and everything in the story is happening during the gameplay, which is a really long-winded way of saying that basically it's chess where the pieces on the board argue with each other, and that's how the story gets told. Or it's it's not a visual novel with fighting in it. Maybe it's a roguelike. I don't know. I don't really know how to describe it. Anyway, it's a turn-based tactics game with sort of narrative. Does that do it? I don't know.
Yeah, great.
You've said it, right? I don't really know how to describe it.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's probably right. I'd probably kind of describe it maybe as kind of like miniature Banner Saga, with but chess sort of thing.
Yeah, when we were pitching it way back, we kind of looked at it, a couple of publishers, though we didn't end up going that way. I was pitching it as the Banner Saga meets Threes, and in my head that's still the correct description of it, though every single person I said that to, including everyone on the team, was like, no, don't say that, Jon, that's a terrible description of it. So I don't know, that's what I like to think of it as.
So sort of tell us a little bit more about how it came about, because sort of your most recent games, kind of 80 Days and Heaven's Vault, kind of they both kind of had a certain kind of historical aspect to them, but they're both set in quite kind of futuristic worlds. Kind of why did you decide to go back to kind of medieval England and the Knights of the Round Table for this?
Actually, I've always wanted to make a King Arthur game. I'm a massive Arthurian nerd. I always have been. My favorite book when I was a kid was The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is just a glorious, wonderful, soulful, empathetic book, and it does lots of really clever things with the way it retells the legend. But also, obviously, I grew up as a boy in Britain, and I think it's true of all boys in Britain. It might be true of all girls in Britain as well, that I just basically quite liked hitting people with swords for my entire childhood. That was a great thing to do. My wife also enjoyed hitting people with swords when she was a child too, so I'm pretty sure it's not a gender thing. So I've kind of always been inspired by those legends, and it ties up with a lot of other things as well. Like we have a kind of love of landscape at Inkle as well. Joe's next game that he's working on is a game about the Highlands, and I spent a lot of childhood holidays in Wales on the coastlines and the caves, and just that whole sense of the British landscape that doesn't come out in games very much, or we thought it didn't come out in games very much. And then Death Stranding came along, which is quite clearly set in British Northumberland, but ignoring that. So yeah, no, I've always wanted to make an Arthurian game, though we've just never really had a game to go with the setting, I think, because you could make a kind of 80 Days style game, but it would be very slow and quite hard to play, because what would you be doing? And would you just be doing like nightly conversations? I think it's one of those ideas we've had knocking around for a cool setting that we'd like to do something with, but we never had the game mechanic for it. And then, so actually Pendragon is unusual for us, really, because it's the first game we've made where we had the game mechanic first, right, and not the narrative setting first. Because normally we say, right, we want to make a game about archaeology, right? What do archaeologists do? Or we want to make a game about traveling around the world. Well, how do we bring that to life? Here we had a completely theoretical, abstract 2D top-down board game thing that we were playing with mostly for fun, and the Arthurian theme kind of glued itself to it, and then completely rewrote the game rules over the course of several years, because we couldn't just staple the two together. We had to do quite a lot of work to make it work. But I've always loved Arthurian stuff. I think I wrote an Arthurian novel when I was 11, and it was awful. It might have done.
I mean, how much did it change between that kind of early prototype almost to what's in the final game?
So a game like this is full of lots of little specific rules, right? And they all have to fit together, and they all have to work, and they have to not overbalance or underbalance or be redundant or whatever. So there's quite a lot of detail in the design. But I remember we had a working game about a year and a half ago, and it was two symmetric teams fighting against each other on this 5x5 grid with the basic kind of rule set that the game has. There are these two stances, and they control the board in different ways. And the main design was built by Tom Cale, who's one of our developers. And he was saying, well, I don't know that this is enough for in a whole game. I think it might get repetitive after a while. I think we should add. And he came up with this huge list of things that we should add. And it was like people with bows and arrows and squares you can't go into and all sorts of things. And I said, no, look, we've got a design that works. Let's just put a narrative on it. Let's keep it simple, keep it elegant, get it made. And I laid down a series of red lines of things we were definitely not going to do. And Tom likes to remind me that at the end of the project, we have broken every single one of those red lines. There were about 15 of them, I think. And so the game it's recognizably the same game, but it's also very, very different. I think there's one level now. If you play the game on loop and it kind of restructured itself every time you play, and every level is different and all the setups and the context is different. But if you start the game as Sir Kay, who you have to unlock and find, which was a red line that we broke, then his first level is a 5x5 grid in which you have 4 people and they have 4 people. And that is the original board game. So that one level is actually pretty much correct. But none of the rest of it is.
What was the kind of the biggest red line that you was like, no, we definitely must not cross this? But then things happened.
So it started out as one of the key ideas we started with. We wanted to make a symmetric game, right, where you have two teams and they both have the same information and the same target. So you're in this corner and you're trying to get to that corner, and they're in that corner and they're trying to get to this corner, and that was the game. And we wanted to make it, have a co-op mode, have a multiplayer mode, so you could sort of just play this game against a symmetric partner. So the biggest red line I think that we broke is that we changed the win condition for the two teams. So if you reach the far corner, you win, but if they reach the far corner, they don't win. And that was enormous in terms of what it did to the game balance, and it was really, really big in terms of what it did to the AI, because we had to rewrite the AI completely, because suddenly it would get to the end and go, I've won! Oh, well, wait, what, I've not won? I don't know what to do now.
Yeah.
And all the enemy pieces would kind of collect on the far side of the board and just stand around going, well, we don't know what to do. So that was quite a lot of work. But I think everything that we did, everything that we changed was always because we'd play the game with kind of the narrative that we'd put onto it, and we'd go, wait, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't have enough momentum, or this doesn't feel exciting, or we just couldn't write a line of dialogue to explain why the game had suddenly ended because this enemy character had done this thing. It just didn't make any sense. So we were constantly rewriting the rules to get the story to work. It's still the strangest story we've ever put together, though, because it's so assembled on the fly that it's quite an odd project.
I mean, there seems to be a kind of King Arthur revival going on kind of recently. Sort of last year, we had sort of Joe Cornish's film, like The Kid Who Would Be King, and this year, there's sort of Cursed on Netflix, which is kind of all to do with the Arthurian legends. And we should have had, there's another film coming out about, Gawain the Green Knight, this year, at some point. Sort of, what do you think? What is it about the legends of King Arthur that are so kind of compelling and kind of relevant to kind of kind of this day and age?
I think there was one other I noticed actually, which is I think there's a Star Wars spin-off series coming out, which is basically the Jedi of the Round Table. I forget what it's called, but I think there are two parts of that question. I think there's, why is there an Arthurian revival now? And I think the reason for that is that Game of Thrones has come and gone, and Arthur is the next logical step after Game of Thrones. That's my feeling. People are looking for something which is like Game of Thrones, but has less of the fantasy stuff in it and feels a bit more grounded. And that I think that's how we got to it. And it also comes from kind of Star Wars having a little spike of popularity and kind of fading, that sort of people running around with swords. Okay, let's reframe that in a different way. And I think Arthur is a good endpoint for that. Why do people keep coming back to Arthur is a really interesting and difficult question, I think, because it means different things to everyone you talk to about it. Like some people, it's all about knights in armor and the kind of chivalric jousting stuff. But then for some people, it's all about Merlin and magic and creepy caves and weird waterfalls and stuff. And all the different takes that you see go in a different way on that. For me, right now, though, the thing that really locked it as a narrative choice for us was partly that it fitted with the game mechanic, and partly was what's been happening in politics, actually, in Britain and America. And as we move towards a political environment in which our leaders lie to us consistently all the time, suddenly this ideal of Arthur, the good king, who has a round table where they discuss things and they settle things in a fair and just way, and that court is so good that it just has to be destroyed, and it is destroyed, and no one manages to save it. That feels like such a good description of what's happening in the political environment in Britain and America right now, that it felt like a story that somehow suddenly wasn't just play acting swords anymore, but was somehow actually talking about the experience of being alive in 2020 in a way. Which is heavy, but it's true. I mean, it's kind of actually enough motivation to get through writing something if it feels like it's talking about something. And that idea of using Arthur as a kind of representation of what good leadership could be like if we only stopped attacking each other the whole time. Actually, that's right at the core of the T.H. White book that I mentioned earlier, The Once and Future King, which I loved as a kid. So it's not an original idea to use this metaphor. But I think that's kind of, that for me, that's one of the things that's really core to Arthur, is it's this idea of what we want Britain to be like, especially Britain, what we think it ought to be like. It ought to be rational and fair and just and compassionate. And those are the qualities of the Round Table. I'm not sure Britain has ever actually been like that. I don't think we're like that now. But it's a nice ideal to have. It's kind of, yeah. And there's something very uniquely British about that, I think. Or certainly very un-American about it. And so much culture is kind of trying to be American at the moment. And I feel like that's becoming more and more problematic. Like all good kind of cultural myths, it's got so many fluffy edges and it fits into things in so many different ways. I think everyone has their own opinion and take on it. And I don't think any of the reasons that I've mentioned are the reasons why the Star Wars writers will be doing the Jedi of the Round Table. I don't think they're interested in the hypocrisy of the current political management. But they might be. But we'll see.
Doing a TV or a film adaptation of kind of those Arthurian legends is, say, one thing. But how do you kind of go about kind of turning, all of those things that you've just spoken about into how do you make that interactive? Particularly with this, in that you can play it, again and again, and it's designed to be played, multiple times with multiple different characters. Kind of how do you kind of make it interactive like that?
So I think we spent a while sort of really wondering about how much narrative we could possibly get into it, because I mean, at its heart, it's a replayable game. It's a game that you play over and over again. You go, oh, I'll have another round of that. That's the threes aspect of the Banner Saga meets threes, right? And you can't put a narrative on a repeatable game because you get sick of the narrative, right? That's obvious. Everyone knows that. So how do you solve that? And then at some point, I think I had a kind of breakthrough when I suddenly realized something that's actually really obvious about Arthurian legends, which is that I've read the Arthurian legends hundreds and hundreds of times in different tellings. I've seen that story done by this person and that person and the other person. And a legend like that, because we kind of basically know what's in it already, or we feel like we do, even if we don't know the details, it's not about the story that you tell, it's about the retelling of the story that you can tell. And that, I think, was our way in, was this idea that instead of making Pendragon the story of Arthur or the story of the fall of Arthur, it's a machine for retelling the story of the fall of Arthur. So every time you play, you get a different way that Arthur can end up getting killed on the battlefield of Camelot, which is pretty much how the legend ends. And a different route. and a different set of people and a different set of adventures and a different set of discoveries, and but they all end in this same culmination, this same tragic point of kind of everything coming together and falling apart. And that spoke to me as being like a good telling of the legends, but also a good interactive context. Every time is different, but there's this nice sense of inevitability and a nice sense of where you're headed to every time as well, which is consistent. And then you get different angles on it with every time that you play it, and all the little bits of narrative kind of add together to so you do get a kind of greater sense of the story the more that you play, because you see more aspects of it, even though it isn't just one story, which is a weird idea, but I think it makes sense because it's a legend, because it's an old legend that we've seen retold and retold 100 times. You can kind of do that within the game, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly like the way that you can find out about kind of new places, either by kind of encountering certain characters or choosing, to visit certain locations. That reminded me a lot about a lot of 80 Days. Kind of picking up on those kind of like little bits of detail and thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I'll make sure I direct myself towards this point. Was that kind of structure important to give like each run through like a kind of clear through line?
I wonder if I think every run through has got a clear through line or not. We've tried to make systems to do that. Anyway, yes, no, obviously the game is brilliant and it's amazing. It's fantastic. Sorry, I went off track for a second. So what was the question again? Oh yeah, right. So the first thing we wanted to do, it's kind of built in layers, basically. The first thing you want to do is just make sure that each encounter is interesting and makes sense and is coherent. So that was kind of the first thing that we did. And then we were playing a version of the game where you had a fight in this castle, and then you had a fight in this forest, and then you had a chat with some villagers, and then you had a fight with a forest. And when you've played that for a while, you start to notice that the most obvious theme is that this location in the future wasn't set up by a location in the past. And if you want to give people a sense of tension and a sense of progression, then the more that you concede things, the better. So, and that's exactly what we were doing. That's exactly the same thought process that we went through when we were writing 80 Days. Actually, I remember the same process of we had these individual cities and we started to think, wait, if city A told us a bit about city B and then we arrived in it and it paid off, that would give us more of a sense of the rooms of the world being glued together. It's like putting a window in a level here where you can see the level that you're going to go to later in a in a 3D game. It's that sense of continuity and gluing the world together. But like everything in Pendragon, nothing is really authored. There's no story. There is no through line. What there is a kind of machine for assembling content in different ways. So what we ended up doing was building a system which creates that sense of seeding and payoff for the various little storylines. And there are some, specific storylines that you'll see a couple of times, and then some that are quite hard to find, and then some that are a bit more repeatable. But it is just another level of the story machine. This thing really is run by a machine, and the machine says, oh, it's been a while since we had a plot, so let's thread a plot in now. Okay, that's paying off. Oh, the player's gone there. Right, let's pay that out. Yes. It's a bit like we've been training our robot Shakespeare to tell Arthurian legends for the last year. It's
I mean, has that in itself, like the underlying kind of your underlying kind of scripting engine, has that changed much over the course of development?
It hasn't changed, but we have been using it in a completely different way than we've ever used it before. So like one of the things that when we came to start Pendragon, so we just finished Heaven's Vault, which was a really long project. It was 4 years worth or something, and it's a very choice-based, dialogue-heavy game, as you know, because I'm sure you I know you played it. And one of the things we wanted to do when we started Pendragon was make a game that didn't have any dialogue choices in it at all, but we were going to use the same engine that we had anyway. So what we did instead was all of the scripting engine that's kind of running the narrative, all of the choices inside that are actually things that you do on the board. So there'll be a choice which represents attacking a wolf, and there's a choice which represents running away from a black knight, and there's a choice which represents killing someone who just killed your friend. And the player doesn't choose those choices explicitly. The player just moves around on the board, and the choices get chosen by the engine. In the end, we decided it would be nice to have some dialogue choices too, so we put them back in again, which obviously was easy to do because that's what the engine does anyway. But that means that the structure on the inside of Pendragon is not really like anything we've made before. It's quite crazy. There was a long period, I think, right up until about March, when I really didn't think the game was actually going to work, because I had this feeling that it was sort of hanging together, but people would play it and just find a million edge cases that we hadn't covered, and it would just, you wouldn't be able to play it without already knowing what to do. So I'm still quite surprised that we're actually about to release it. It feels, it feels a little bit like someone's going to push it and it's going to fall over.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like how, that in each run through, you see place names and locations kind of being shuffled around and remixed a little bit. Either kind of coming up in different combinations or slightly different places, and it makes it feel kind of very ethereal and kind of mythic, like it's like it is a kind of oral story being handed down and sort of slightly changed over time. Was this kind of like, is this just kind of like a part of the narrative engine, or was it kind of deliberate to give it that kind of legend like kind of quality?
Oh no, it really actually makes me incredibly happy to hear you describe it that way, because that is exactly what we wanted. I don't know if you remember the 1979 John Boorman movie Excalibur, which is one of those films that nobody watches anymore, but everyone of my generation remembers vividly, I think because of Helen Mirren. But anyway, and it opens with this scene of there's like a valley between Uther Pendragon and the tower, which contains the Lady Igraine, who he wants to go and act, shall we say. And he gets Merlin to help him, and Merlin fills the valley with this thick, misty fog, and they ride across the fog to cross this valley and break into this tower. And then the fog never really goes away, and the entire rest of the film is lost in this thick, murky, soupy fog. And you get this sense of things being never quite where they're supposed to be. And I love that sense of everything being blurry at the edges. And it's like when you look at maps from the Middle Ages or kind of old maps, and they sort of represent what the world looks like, but they're sort of completely wrong as well. And people living in that time, in 700 AD or 600 AD, wouldn't really have had a sense that a map was a real thing at all. But like geography would have been up for debate. And if you wandered this way, you might end up anywhere, really. And it would be very easy to get lost once you were outside of your own space. And then everything you heard, every story that you heard was retold and retold and retold. There was no idea of there being a truth. There was just a repetition and a changing of narratives. And everything is negotiable in that space, and everything is kind of lost and uncertain. And I love that. And things like the map in Pendragon, that you explore the country. We spent a long time trying to work out, how do you make a map that's coherent enough that you can explore and take decisions and go to places, but without being like reliable, without being something that you can go, well, I'm going to go from here to here to here to here, and then I'm going to plan it like an Ordnance Survey map, because that's completely the wrong feel. And we tried all sorts of things. We tried maps that kind of moved around during a single playthrough, that all kind of just restructured themselves, or maps where you could only ever see a puddle that was right next to you, all sorts of stuff. But what we ended up with, I think, is fairly simple, but I think it's important that it captures that tone of, you never really know where you are or where you're going to go next or what's around the corner, but there's no reason why you should, because I think getting lost in the mists, that's really important for the tone of the thing. The heroes are off to find Arthur and to save him at the final battle, but they don't even know where he is, and that feels to me, that's tonally exactly right, and I find that quite exciting.
Did the idea of having multiple characters, was that kind of born out of that, or was that, because I think the ones that I found, at least, they all sort of start in slightly different places on the map anyway. And so sort of you naturally kind of have those different journeys kind of taking place, or kind of was it kind of was there ever a point where you only sort of had like one character that was kind of making all these different journeys?
Actually, that's a good question. I kind of struggle to remember, actually. I think originally all of the pieces on your team were going to be completely generic and identical to each other, like pawns in a game of chess, really. And then at some point we thought it would be a nice idea if there was some of them were named heroes, which had some kind of ability that the other ones didn't have, but we weren't sure what ability that actually was. And we went through lots of designs where they had extra lives, or they could heal each other, or they would survive when other people wouldn't, or where you could split your party off and then go different ways and rejoin. And I mean, we really tried everything, I think. And then somehow we slowly started to realize, the idea kind of emerged from the mist, that a core part of the storytelling was just getting different senses of different characters coming through, because that changed the tone of what you were doing. So I think the moment of realization for us was when I had a game where you were playing as Guinevere. I think she was the first character that we put in the game, because we just liked that start of Guinevere going off to find Arthur. That felt sort of romantic and epic. And then the idea of having Morgana Le Fay, who's like the evil witch, very much the villain of the Arthurian legends, being a playable character who's just really mean all the time to everyone and is constantly nasty. And that just reframes almost everything that she says and does. And that was so much fun. But then we started to play around with that. And then we realized this idea of an unlockable roster of heroes gave us a nice game structure, because you can unlock heroes on one run and then play with them on the next run. But it also gave us lots of interesting ways to sort of change up how the game feels to play. I think that was one of Tom's red lines, actually, was he suggested that characters should start with different abilities. And I said, no, that's a terrible idea. And of course, now every character you unlock has a different unique ability, which kind of changes the way that they play. And it seems core to the game to me now.
Were there any sort of Knights of the Round Table, particular characters that you wanted to include, but kind of sort of ended up sort of on the cutting room floor?
Yes, there are. There's a lot of the Knights of the Round Table. When you look at them closely, they start to get quite generic. So, like we have Sir Gawain, who's this kind of hot-headed drunk, and he's a great character in the myths, because he's sort of honourable, but he's a womanizer, and he's a bit of a brute, and he always takes the wrong decisions, but he always does them for the right reasons. Like he has a great heart, but not much head. He has like 5 brothers or something, and they're all kind of like Gareth and Gaheris and Agravain and all these people, and they're all very identikit. So while I thought at the start, oh yeah, I really need Sir Agravain, he's great, by the time I got to the end of the game, I couldn't think of a single unique thing about Sir Agravain at all. So he's not there. And I thought for a long time about including Sir Galahad, who, if you don't know the Arthurian myths, Sir Galahad's one defining feature is that he's completely, totally, utterly perfect. Like, and in all ways, absolutely, completely. And his one job is he finds the Holy Grail and he's allowed to pick it up because he's so completely perfect. But then I thought that didn't actually sound like that much fun. So we didn't write him. And I know we're going to get emails once we launch saying, I'd like to play the whole game as Mordred. And I don't know what we'll go about that, because it would be fun, but it would be rather difficult. The other problem that we had is that almost all the Knights of the Round Table in the original legends are boys. They're all just boys, apart from Guinevere, really. So we wanted to up the number of female characters as well. So we brought in a lot of heroes from the Mabinogion, the Welsh song cycle that sort of predates the Arthurian myth. So we have Lady Rhiannon is actually from the Mabinogion, and Branwen is from the Mabinogion. And that was a lot of fun, because then we could bring in some nice Welsh swearing as well, and just kind of explore the Welsh side of things a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, sort of you've sort of touched on the earlier that, you know, some of the characters you kind of wanted like to have more abilities. You know, but you've sort of eventually pared that back. Kind of was there like a temptation to kind of like to either kind of, you know, just run with it and like have everyone with lots of different abilities, but is, as you say, like you were sort of mentioning earlier, that, you know, was it actually quite difficult to come up with unique abilities for what are largely quite generic, you know, kind of generic characters?
So I think a lot of that comes back down to the game design. So one of the problems that we had at the start, kind of when we moved out of the prototype and into full production, was we had this board game which had an incredibly tight rule set. There weren't too many rules, and it was fairly easy to pick up and play. But every time we tweaked a rule even a little bit, then the game would overbalance straight away. Like the first player would just trounce across the board, or it would just end up in a stalemate that no one could beat. So we spent a while trying to find what sort of abilities could we give to players that wouldn't just demolish the game instantly. And then we kind of found our groove with that after a while, I think. And we started to, I mean, in the game now, there may be 30, 35 special abilities, and some of them are unique to particular characters. So, only Merlin can teleport and only Morgana can turn people into pigs. But some of them, the rest are kind of assigned. They're kind of coupled up with narrative events and then assigned to people as those narrative events happen. So one of our core ideas is that as things happen to the characters, they change the story that they tell about themselves, and then that gives them some kind of ability on the battlefield. And once we got into the groove of the kind of abilities that made the game fun to play, then it wasn't too bad building them out. And and now I've got a list of about 20 more that I'd like to implement, but we had to stop. So that might be an update or something, I don't know.
Do you think that the kind of, obviously, like the turn-based strategy genre as a whole is sort of, quite kind of different to what you've kind of done previously? Now that kind of Pendragon is, sort of like just about coming out, like, do you think it's a genre that you'll return to in the future, or is this like you've had enough of turn-based strategy games for now?
It's an interesting question. I never really know what we're going to do 6 months ahead of us starting to do it, so it's hard to answer it honestly. My feeling at the moment is, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was make a turn-based strategy which was really elegant. Because I don't know, often when I look at turn-based strategy games, I'm kind of interested by the tone and I like the style of gameplay, but I look at the screenshot and the sheer number of elements and pieces and numbers, and it's like when you buy a physical board game and it's got 3 different kinds of counter, and you just think, oh man. And that energy of learning the complexities of a fiddly rule set, really, it doesn't appeal to me particularly. So we wanted to make something that was really, really streamlined. And what we found was, it's incredibly difficult to make a game which is streamlined, but also like interesting and deep. Games that are streamlined tend to be either simple or impossible. You have noughts and crosses, which is simple, and you have Go, which is completely impossible. They're both very streamlined games. And those games with lots of complexity and lots of subtle and interesting and clever and complicated bits and extra rules, they have a lot of playability because you can explore that whole space of stuff, but without the game necessarily becoming like too easy or just completely impenetrable once you can understand the rules. Which is a long way of saying that I'm not sure that we'd be able to come up with another game that we felt was as streamlined as this one. And I don't want to make something that's just more complicated and more fiddly, really. So I don't think we'll be making another turn-based strategy game anytime soon, though it's a bit of a shame because we've built all this technology now for being able to hook narrative into a strategy game that we probably ought to use it. But also this one was really hard. Like all of our games seem to be really hard to make. Like Heaven's Vault was really full of content and full of detail, and that was quite draining to produce it all in the end. This game has just been really technically hard. Absolutely everything in the game turns out to be a system. Like there's an AI that plays what the enemies are going to play, and there's an AI that designs the board layout, and there's an AI that plans the narrative, and there's an AI that describes the movement from a square to another square, and there's an AI, and it's just by the end of it we're just so sick of balancing all these AIs. But I kind of want the next thing that we make to be really bloody linear, actually. I mean, it won't be. It would be nice if it was.
As you you do kind of look towards the future, like what do you actually kind of enjoy doing more? Because like both Pendragon and 80 Days and the Sorcery games are all kind of adaptations of other series, other novels. Whereas Heaven's Vault, this was something completely new. Like, do you have a preference for, like, do you prefer doing adaptations of things, or would does doing something completely new like present a whole set of different challenges, or is it easier somehow, or sort of
doing something new is so hard. I think when we started Heaven's Vault, we didn't really realize quite how hard it is to make a whole world and a set of characters from scratch. And it should be easier because you're just making stuff up, right? You don't have to satisfy anybody. But but getting things to kind of fit together and to make sense and to feel coherent. Like one of the things I'm really proud of with the world of Heaven's Vault is that it doesn't have that many weird elements in it, but all the weird elements it does have come out in lots of different ways. So, you know, there are the rivers through the nebulas of space, but they also tell you about the way the theology works in the game. And it also tells you about the kind of the big plot that's going on in the background of the game. And it also is how you move around between the environments. So it kind of feeds out in lots of different ways. It isn't just an idea and an idea and an idea kind of stacked on top of each other. And that kind of world building, that's really important to me, is that worlds are internally coherent and not just built from an accretion of loads of stuff glued together. I've been watching Star Trek with my daughter, who's 7, and we've been really enjoying it. And Star Trek is a wonderful, fun family experience, but they do just make up a new thing every week. And by the end of 5 seasons, even my daughter is like, well, why don't they just get the machine from 2 series ago that did this thing to solve the problem? And you go, oh, no, because it's not there anymore. It's gone. And like, well, yeah.
It's kind of that classic Lord of the Rings. Like, why did they not just drop the ring in with the eagles?
Yeah, exactly. And it's because, you know, the story's not about that, but still. So I think trying to make Heaven's Vault make sense in that way was incredibly hard work. And then you've got the other balance of trying to work out what people are going to like and respond to and react to. And I still don't really have a sense of whether, you know, how many people were there in the world who saw Heaven's Vault and its world and its universe and thought, wow, I really want to explore that. And how many people were there who looked at it and said, well, that doesn't connect with me at all. I'm not going anywhere near that. And, you know, if we'd have made the protagonist different, if we'd have made her kinder or funnier, or made it a team of 3 people, or instead of having a robot had a dog, and all of these decisions that we took, would they have increased people's love for the game or decreased? I have no idea. I mean, in the end, you have to do whatever your heart tells you to, but that doesn't solve a lot of your problems because you still have to come up with an idea. Whereas adapting stuff is really fun because you kind of know already what it is you want to hit, and you know what you can't change, and you know what you can play with. And it definitely comes with its own challenges and problems, but it's just a much more fun playing in someone else's environment. But I think that's just another way of saying it's less work, right? I mean, it's probably easier to write fan fiction for Star Trek than it is to create a program about space traveling people. It's probably easy. You can probably just get on with the storytelling bit faster because you've got less things you have to build before you do that. It's like playing a game versus building your own computer and then playing a game on it. Like, you can do either, but one of them is easier. So I don't, but it doesn't mean to say that the next thing will be an adaptation, because I don't know necessarily what it is I would want to adapt next, but it is fun.
I
do enjoy it.
I mean, sort of like, obviously, you know, for all of your games, you know, the text and the story, you know, they clearly sit at the heart of, you know, all of the games that you've done so far. You know, you mentioned earlier that, you know, with Pendragon it was actually the other way around, but like, do you think that having the story first, does that kind of make things easier, or is it sometimes, you know, have you found that with Pendragon having that gameplay mechanic first was, you know, that kind of laid the foundations, or kind of which of your kind of 2 kind of approaches do you think is kind of like the best foundation for any kind of game?
I mean, in general, I think I would always start with, if not the story, but kind of the character and their position in the world. Like, you know, if I was kind of trying to map out the best process for making a game efficiently that you're going to like, you start off with a character that you want to be, and you say, what does that character do? So, you know, for Heaven's Vault, it was very much, right, you're an archaeologist. What do archaeologists do? Well, they explore old ruins. Great. They dig things up slowly. No, we won't include that. That's boring. They negotiate whether or not it's okay to give artifacts to people, given that they're very valuable objects. Oh, that's interesting. We'll include that. They translate inscriptions. Oh, that's very interesting. Let's explore that properly. You know, and then you're away. You build your game around that. And that works great. And it means that whatever you end up with is going to be interesting, but it's also going to be true to the core of what you were trying to do, right? And I think that's really important. And I think a lot of games don't do it that way round. And you can tell, you know, when you get to the very, very end step of playing this game, I mean, it's what people talk about when they talk about ludonarrative dissonance, really. I mean, that's what it is just you have a character in the game who is supposed to be like this, but spends all of their time doing that. And that's because these two things have been come up with separately or in the wrong order or something. So I think on Pendragon, we actually spent quite a long time, like, as I said, rewriting the game to make it work with the narrative. And I don't think that was an efficient or like particularly sensible process. It was just the one that we found ourselves doing. That was kind of an interesting challenge, though. But the trade-off for that is sometimes that when you come up with a story or a world that you want to set your game in, actually finding a playable activity to go with that person is really difficult. Like, there's a real shortage of good detective games, right? Of detective games where you actually feel like a detective, which should be the easiest thing in the world because we know what detectives do. But making a playable detection process, I don't know that anyone's really cracked that yet or really nailed it. There's been some games that have ways of solving that problem, but they're mostly not repeatable. Like you can make Her Story, but you can't keep making Her Story because it's so uniquely what it is. And you can make Obra Dinn, but you can't really repeatedly make Obra Dinn either because it would get pretty repetitive on the fifth or sixth iteration of that concept. And then there are people like I think it's Frogwares who make the Sherlock Holmes games, and they have some deduction mechanics they're really kind of attached to, and they've been developing for a long time. And do they feel like detective work? They sort of do, but I can't put it in front of my mum who loves Poirot on the TV and have her enjoy it. She just wouldn't at all. So it's definitely not talking to the same kind of person. So that would be a really interesting problem to solve, actually. Like, how do you make a detective game where the detection feels like being a detective without actually having to be like Sherlock Holmes? I don't know. I mean, that sort of thing is interesting. So I guess the nice thing about Pendragon was we just didn't have to worry about any of that. We just, we just had to make the narrative work with what we had.
I think that's probably all of the questions that I've got. So thank you so much, Jon, for joining us at EGX Digital to talk about Pendragon. Can you remind the good people watching when it's out and where they can find out more about it?
Sure, super happily. So it's out on the 22nd of September. It's going to be on Steam and also on GOG at launch, along with the soundtrack. And if you want to find out about it, you can follow us on Twitter at Inkle Studios. And if you Google for Inkle Pendragon, you'll find our homepage, which has got the trailer and lots of lovely screenshots and that kind of stuff.
Great. Right. Well, for those of you watching, stay tuned to the EGX Digital channel, where you'll find more great streams and panels coming up shortly. But that's all from us right now. Goodbye.